Tires skidded hard across the gravel drive as an unmarked Range Rover breached the iron gates of Lambrook School without an escort or press officer in sight. Behind the wheel sat the Prince of Wales, his knuckles white against the leather, driving in absolute silence after a sanitized phone call from the headmaster's office attempted to downplay a lethal incident. Deep inside the equestrian stables, a deliberate act of sabotage had just unfolded. Someone had slit the underbelly seam of Princess Charlotte's saddle girth before a high-speed jumping session, an invisible trap designed to throw an 11-year-old girl onto concrete. Beside the stalls, 8-year-old Prince Louis stood accused, his name printed alone on a formal disciplinary notice for pulling the brass emergency siren that halted the trial. In British elite schooling, an institutional code of discretion dictates that any disturbance involving royal blood must be handled internally to shield public optics. That protocol demanded an 8-year-old boy sign a written apology for making a scene, ignoring the fact that he had just stopped an older peer from humiliating his sister and slandering their late grandmother, Princess Diana. William's arrival was no routine parent conference. It was a reckoning against the exact brand of toxic silence that suffocated his own youth. Minutes later, the future king was seen standing alone at the perimeter gate, his hand gripping the cold iron as tears broke through his composure. Did Prince Louis act with heroic instinct by putting his family above the crown, or should institutional protocol always come first? Leave a comment with number 1 if you stand with Prince Louis, or number 2 if royal decorum must be protected at all costs, as we uncover the full truth behind these closed doors. Behind the manicured hedges of Berkshire, the equestrian complex of Lambrook School was designed to project an aura of effortless aristocratic grace. With its whitewashed stable blocks, polished mahogany tack rooms, and meticulously raked sand arenas, this private facility was intended to offer royal children a rare sanctuary of grit and discipline away from palace courtiers. Here, under the heavy brim of a velvet riding helmet, young heirs were meant to master poise, control, and character. Yet, beneath the veneer of country leisure, the grounds had quietly devolved into a covert arena of class tension, subtle power plays, and inherited resentments. At 11 years old, Princess Charlotte moved through these grounds under an invisible, suffocating armor. From the moment she took her first steps in front of international press banks, a singular doctrine had been quietly hammered into her core: never react, never break posture, and never make a scene. In the lexicon of the British establishment, this restraint is venerated as royal poise, an unspoken mandate requiring a young girl to swallow fear, humiliate herself in silence, and present a serene facade no matter how sharp the provocation. Where other children were permitted tears, temper, and instinctive defense, Charlotte had been rigorously trained to freeze her expression, drop her chin, and let any assault roll off her shoulders for the sake of institutional decorum. 8-year-old Prince Louis existed in an entirely different orbit. As the third-born child in a rigid hierarchy, he lived without the crushing weight of direct succession, granted a wider tether than his older siblings. He spoke in bursts of unvarnished honesty, ran rather than walked, and possessed a face that betrayed every passing emotion without a moment of calculated delay. While palace commentators frequently reduced his fierce personality to charming antics, those within the family circle understood his true compass: an absolute, uncompromising loyalty to his older sister. Having spent his early years looking to Charlotte as his emotional anchor and protector, Louis had forged a fierce, protective instinct. Her physical safety and dignity were his non-negotiable boundaries. An unwritten, predatory law quietly governed the dynamics of elite boarding and prep schools. In these rarefied corridors, older pupils from dynastic backgrounds quickly learned that royal children were uniquely defenseless targets. The royal protection officers stationed discreetly beyond the perimeter fence were trained exclusively to neutralize external threats. They held no jurisdiction over a whisper, a shove, or an engineered confrontation between pupils in a stable aisle. Because young royals were strictly forbidden from engaging in physical altercations or retaliating with harsh words, an arrogant peer could push them to the brink with total impunity confident that the victim's own training would seal their lips. That delicate equilibrium shattered when Prince George completed his final term at Lambrook. For years, the eldest brother had served as a formidable buffer in the courtyards and arenas. His presence commanding deference and keeping would be tormentors at bay. His departure for Eton College left an unmistakable vacuum, exposing Charlotte and Louis directly to the complex social hierarchy of the school. Without their older brother standing guard, Charlotte became an immediate focal point for individuals eager to test the limits of royal endurance. The gathering storm found its architect in an older boy, a 14-year-old pupil whose family name occupied the top tier of the school's founding benefactors. His father sat as a dominant force on the Board of Governors, holding considerable financial sway over the institution's multi-million-pound expansion projects. In elite British education, the dynamic between a high-paying patron and a school's governing body operates under an unspoken covenant of mutual preservation. A generous financial endowment often buys a child an impenetrable shield of administrative immunity. Aware of his family's immense leverage, this older boy calculated that the upcoming equestrian jumping trials offered the perfect stage to assert dominance. Watching Charlotte prepare her pony in the shadow of the stables, he saw an 11-year-old girl bound hand and foot by royal decorum, unable to raise her voice or strike back. To him, the arena was not merely a sports venue, but an open theater where he could shatter the composure of the Wales family, fully assured that the administrative machinery of the school would protect his name, while forcing the young princess into silence. The air inside the lower stable corridor hung heavy with the scent of damp straw, polished leather, and cedar shavings. Sunlight filtered through the high, dusty clerestory windows, casting long, fractured shadows across the stone floor. It was the quiet interval right before the start of the afternoon's jumping trials, a brief 15-minute window where staff members were scattered across the outer paddocks and the inspection course. In the dimmest stall at the far end of the aisle, Princess Charlotte stood beside her pony, meticulously fastening the throat latch of a vintage leather bridle. It was an heirloom piece, bearing the subtle, worn crest of the Spencer family, a personal keepsake passed down to preserve a quiet connection to her grandmother's lineage. Her quiet focus was shattered as a tall, heavy silhouette blocked the narrow entrance to the stall. The older boy stepped fully into the doorway, resting one shoulder against the wooden frame with an insolent, measured ease. There was no accidental bump, no playful banter. His posture was deliberately confrontational. He stood close enough that his shadow swallowed the girl completely, cutting off her only path back into the open courtyard. On his face was the practiced, mocking grin of someone who had rehearsed his malice and knew precisely how untouchable his family name made him within those stone walls. Leaning in closer until his voice was little more than a venomous whisper, he bypassed the usual schoolyard insults to strike at the deepest wound in the Wales household. He sneered that her grandmother Diana was nothing more than an unhinged failure whom the royal family had systematically discarded once she outlived her usefulness. His words grew sharper, his breath cold against the quiet stall as he mocked the Spencer bloodline, dismissing it as a legacy of scandal and weakness. Looking down into Charlotte's wide, stunned eyes, he drove the cruelty home, telling the young girl that no matter how straight she stood or how carefully she curtsied, she was destined to end up just like Diana, broken, abandoned, and driven mad in total isolation. As the final syllable left his lips, he reached down with a swift, calculated motion and drew a hooked hoof-pick knife from his leather pocket. With two silent, brutal pulls across the underbelly of Charlotte's saddle girth, he severed 2/3 of the heavy load-bearing stitching. It was an act of cold, calculated sabotage. From above, the thick leather appeared entirely intact, but the moment the pony surged over a 4-foot wooden oxer at full gallop, the remaining threads would instantly snap under the rider's shifting weight, throwing an 11-year-old child headfirst beneath galloping hooves and into the solid timber rails. The weight of an entire century's royal conditioning fell upon Charlotte like lead. Every instinct of natural self-preservation screamed at her to shriek for help, to push past him, to run toward the open arena. Yet the rigid discipline drilled into her from infancy paralyzed her on the spot. Her small fingers dug hard into the rough timber of the stable partition until her knuckles turned bone white. Hot tears flooded her eyes, spilling silently down her pale cheeks, but her jaw remained clenched shut. Somewhere deep within her mind, the relentless rule of the institution held her captive. Never make a scene, never show weakness, never react in front of others. Unnoticed by the older boy, 8-year-old Prince Louis had been sorting brushes near the grain bins just 20 paces away. He had seen the cornering, heard the sharp hiss of the insults, and watched the cold gleam of the blade slice through his sister's saddle strap. For an 8-year-old child unburdened by constitutional protocol or palace optics, there was no hesitation, no calculation of consequences, and no fear of authority. He saw his sister cornered, crying, and standing on the brink of catastrophe. Moving with explosive speed, Louis lunged toward the barn's emergency station on the stone wall. Reaching upward with both hands, he grabbed the heavy chain of the brass emergency klaxon and pulled down with his entire body weight. A deafening, mechanical wail tore through the rafters of the stable block, echoing across the arena and freezing dozens of horses, riders, and instructors in their tracks. Before the sound could even peak, Louis turned and charged down the aisle at a dead sprint. With a furious shout that cut straight through the siren's roar, the 8-year-old threw his entire body into the older boy's chest, knocking the teenager off balance and sending him crashing backward into a deep pile of loose straw. Planting his small riding boots firmly on the cobblestones, his face crimson, his fists clenched, and his chest heaving, Prince Louis positioned himself squarely between the sabotaged saddle and the stunned bully, barking the words that brought the entire complex to a dead stop. "Don't you dare touch my sister." The sudden, mechanical shriek of the brass klaxon sliced clean through the Berkshire countryside, tearing the ordered calm of the equestrian complex to pieces. In an instant, the meticulously choreographed rhythm of the jumping trials unraveled into chaos. Across the main arena, thoroughbreds reared against their reins, snorting and kicking up clouds of fine white sand as their riders struggled to maintain control. Stable hands abandoned their pitchforks, clipboards tumbled onto the gravel, and several dozen spectators along the wooden rails surged forward in confusion. Down the dim, stone-flagged corridor of the lower stalls, the sound was deafening, bouncing off the damp brickwork and rattling the iron bars of every partition. Within 90 seconds, the heavy footsteps of authority echoed down the aisle. The headmaster arrived first, his tailored tweed coat flapping around his knees, flanked by 2 senior housemasters and the director of riding. They moved with the hurried urgency of men accustomed to managing minor crises with clinical efficiency. Yet, the exact second they crossed the threshold into the rear grooming stall, their collective stride ceased. The scene before them defied the neat boundaries of prep school protocol. 8-year-old Prince Louis stood planted on the uneven cobblestones, chest heaving beneath his wool jumper, small fists clenched until his knuckles were white, his eyes blazing with an unyielding, protective fury. Behind him, Princess Charlotte was pressed against the wooden stall partition, her riding helmet slightly askew, tears cutting silent tracks through the dust on her cheeks as she gripped the torn leather of her saddle. On the straw-covered floor, slowly rising to his feet with an arrogant sneer, was the 14-year-old pupil. The recognition was instantaneous, and with it came a chilling silence that settled heavily over the administrative staff. The boy dusting off his breeches was not merely an older student, he was the eldest son and heir of the chairman of the Board of Governors. His family name was etched into the stone facade of the school's newly erected science wing. Their private trust fund had underwritten the multi-million-pound expansion of the very stable block they were standing in, and his father held the unilateral power to review, renew, or terminate executive contracts. In the intricate legal structure of elite British independent schools, the Board of Governors functions as an absolute authority, operating without external oversight and holding total sway over administrative tenure. Confronted with the terrifying reality that the chairman's son had committed a malicious, potentially lethal act of sabotage against a member of the royal family, the school's leadership abandoned any impulse toward truth and instinctively initiated a protocol of institutional self-preservation. The cover-up did not happen haphazardly. It was orchestrated with swift, bureaucratic calculation behind the heavy oak doors of the Equestrian Estate Office. The official incident log, a legally binding document intended to record factual occurrences for insurance underwriters and child protection officers, became a canvas of deliberate fiction. The headmaster sat at the mahogany desk, flanked by the housemasters, systematically erasing every inconvenient truth from the afternoon. Every mention of the severed load-bearing stitches on Charlotte's saddle girth was excised completely. The razor-sharp hoof-pick blade that had been drawn in malice was quietly confiscated by a senior instructor and slipped into a desk drawer, stripped of its status as physical evidence. Most critically, the poisonous slurs directed at the late Princess Diana, words crafted to inflict maximum psychological trauma on an 11-year-old girl, were wiped from the record as though they had never been spoken. In that rewritten narrative, the chairman's son was transformed from a calculating predator into an innocent, civic-minded bystander. The document described him as an experienced senior rider who had merely stepped into the stall to assist a younger peer with an unsettled animal, only to be caught in an unfortunate misunderstanding. To make that lie hold, the entire architecture of blame had to be inverted, and the weight of the institution turned squarely against the 8-year-old who had dared to stop the crime. Prince Louis was formally recorded as the sole aggressor in the encounter. The language of the finalized report was clinical, detached, and utterly devastating. The 8-year-old prince was cited for gross misconduct, unprovoked physical aggression against a senior pupil, and the reckless triggering of an emergency alarm system resulting in broad endangerment to livestock and students. Every sentence was crafted by adult hands to establish a paper trail that painted a small child as unstable, violent, and solely responsible for the disruption. The document was designed to serve as a legal shield. If the Wales family ever raised questions, the school would produce a pristine administrative log, proving that the real problem was an undisciplined young prince who could not control his temper. Behind those same closed doors, the disciplinary penalties were drafted with chilling severity. The headmaster proposed a formal decree. Prince Louis would be required to write, sign, and deliver a formal letter of apology to the Board of Governors, personally acknowledging his unruly conduct and expressing remorse for the disruption caused to the school community. To ensure complete control over the narrative and prevent the children from speaking to other pupils, the administration imposed an immediate, season-long suspension on both Louis and Charlotte from all inter-school equestrian competitions. Under the sterile guise of a mandatory cooling-off period to restore campus harmony, the school effectively silenced the victims, locked them out of the arena, and buried the crime beneath a mountain of disciplinary procedure. The betrayal became absolute with the arrival of the palace liaison. Dispatched from London to manage communications and risk mitigation for the royal household, this senior courtier was a career bureaucrat steeped in the traditional machinery of the royal household. To his calculating mind, truth was an expendable commodity when weighed against institutional stability. When presented with the sanitized report, he did not demand to see the physical saddle, he did not ask to speak to Charlotte in private, he did not question the convenient absence of the chairman's son from the list of offenders. Instead, the courtier nodded in quiet agreement, viewing an 8-year-old prince's forced apology as an elegant, low-cost solution to a potentially catastrophic scandal. A public dispute with a high-profile aristocratic benefactor threatened awkward questions, uncomfortable press scrutiny, and an unwanted resurrection of Diana's name in the national headlines. Preserving public relations and protecting institutional decorum outweighed the emotional reality of two terrified children. With a polite, managerial murmur, the courtier rubber stamped the fraudulent document, willingly sacrificing an 8-year-old boy's integrity to appease the machinery of power. Tires bit deep into the wet gravel as the Prince of Wales brought his Range Rover to an abrupt halt directly outside the equestrian pavilion. There were no royal protection outriders clearing the perimeter, no school honor guard, and no advance briefing papers circulating among the staff. The suddenness of the arrival shattered the fragile composure of the school's leadership. Walking past the glass entrance with long, furious strides, William looked past the bowing administrators and made directly for the boardroom, his coat unbuttoned, his jaw set like stone, and his silence carrying far more menace than any raised voice. Stepping into the oak-paneled room, William closed the heavy door behind him with a sharp click that made every adult at the table flinch. The headmaster stood up nervously and gestured toward an empty leather armchair placed at the head of the conference table, an invitation designed to draw the royal father into their formal, procedural dialogue. William remained standing. To take that seat was to endorse their authority and become complicit in a corrupt negotiation. Instead, he planted his boots firmly at the end of the long mahogany table, towering over the room in an icy, suffocating stillness. Across the room, the visual reality of the afternoon's trauma was laid bare. Huddled together in the corner on a pair of low armchairs were his two children. 8-year-old Louis was still wearing his mud-splattered riding jumper, small boots dangling above the Persian carpet, his fingers white-knuckled as he refused to let go of the heavy brass emergency whistle he had torn from the wall. Beside him, Charlotte sat frozen, her posture unnaturally rigid, clutching her hands in her lap while silent tears ran down her pale face. An 11-year-old girl battling every royal instinct to hide her devastation from the hostile room. The headmaster cleared his throat, attempting to open the discussion with a measured speech regarding standard behavioral protocols and the imperative of maintaining equal discipline for all pupils. William did not let him finish the sentence. Reaching into his coat with a cold, deliberate motion, the Prince of Wales pulled out the severed saddle girth and slammed the damaged leather onto the center of the mahogany table. The severed load-bearing threads splayed open beneath the chandelier, exposing the deliberate cut marks and cutting the headmaster's excuses off mid-air. Seeing the administrative narrative unravel, the senior palace courtier intervened, committing the gravest miscalculation of his career. In a low, patronizing tone honed over decades of royal public relations management, the courtier leaned forward and whispered that public optics and family decorum required discretion. He suggested that a brief, private letter of apology signed by Prince Louis would draw a convenient line under the incident and protect the monarchy from unwanted press intrusion. The mention of optics ignited an absolute, chilling fury. William turned on the courtier with eyes cold enough to freeze the room, his voice dropping to a low, lethal register that resonated off the wood paneling. He made it fiercely clear that Louis had acted as a brother should, demonstrating raw courage to save his sister from a life-threatening trap, and declared that under no circumstances would his son ever apologize for defending his family. Slapping his hand onto the table, William issued an uncompromising ultimatum. If the fraudulent disciplinary report was not shredded immediately and the criminal sabotage properly addressed, he would withdraw all 3 royal children from the school before nightfall and instruct Thames Valley Police to open a full forensic investigation. A single, quiet command from William cleared the room within seconds, sending the headmaster, housemasters, and the humiliated palace courtier into the outer corridor. As the heavy oak door clicked shut, the oppressive formality of the institution evaporated, leaving only a father alone with his children. William crossed the Persian rug, abandoned every ounce of royal posture, and dropped directly to his knees on the floor before his 8-year-old son. Pulling Louis into a fierce, unyielding embrace, William held the trembling boy tight against his chest, feeling the small shoulders shake as the child finally let go of his terror. In a low, steady voice thick with emotion, the prince told Louis that he had never been prouder of him, assuring him that saving his sister from harm was the bravest, most honorable act a brother could ever perform. Turning to Charlotte, William reached out and gently wiped the wet tracks of tears from her pale cheeks. Looking directly into her eyes, he shattered the generational curse that had bound royal women for a century. He told his 11-year-old daughter in plain, unequivocal words that neither the sacred memory of her grandmother Diana nor her own personal safety and dignity were ever to be traded away for the institution's fragile peace. He instructed her that whenever cruelty disguised as tradition cornered her, she was never required to swallow her pain or remain silent to protect the crown's image. She was permitted to fight, to scream, and to let her father handle the machinery that followed. Rising to his feet, William took Charlotte's hand in his left and Louis's in his right. Together, the trio walked out of the office, their footsteps echoing with absolute defiance down the school's long, wood-paneled Hall of Honor. They passed the clustered staff members, the silent governors, and the stunned courtier, offering neither a glance nor a word of deference to the adults who had just tried to sacrifice 2 children on the altar of administrative convenience. After placing the children safely inside the warmth of the Range Rover, William did not immediately step into the driver's seat. Instead, he walked toward the heavy, wrought iron perimeter gates separating the elite academy from the open Berkshire Road. Placing both hands against the cold, unyielding iron, his back turned to the school buildings, the future king stood entirely motionless as his shoulders began to heave. The armor of royal composure fractured completely, and the tears he had held back inside the boardroom finally broke free. The floodgates of memory pulled him straight back to September 6, 1997. At 15 years old, William had been forced to put on a dark wool suit, lower his chin, and march in agonizing silence behind his mother's coffin down the mall, surrounded by a million weeping strangers while forbidden from shedding a single tear of his own. For decades, the Crown had demanded that he endure the desecration of Diana's name without raising a fist or speaking a word of defense. Standing at the gate 29 years later, William wept not from defeat, but from a profound, shattering catharsis. His 8-year-old son had just done in 3 seconds what a 15-year-old prince had never been allowed to do for his own mother. Louis had refused to be silenced, putting his own body on the line to defend Diana's honor and protect the sister he loved. Within days, encrypted messages across the school's private parent networks shattered the silence. The leaked revelation of systemic negligence and the administrative cover-up of a life-threatening act sparked immediate outrage among high-profile families. Faced with total reputational collapse, the Board of Governors convened in emergency session, unanimously revoking the fraudulent incident report, expelling the chairman's son, and restoring every equestrian privilege to Charlotte and Louis without condition. The total defeat of the palace liaison struck a devastating blow against the men in gray suits, the entrenched, faceless courtiers who had dictated royal emotional repression for over a century. Through his defiance, the Prince of Wales delivered an unmistakable verdict to the British establishment. The era of sacrificing children's dignity and safety on the altar of royal optics is permanently over. Did Prince William's refusal to surrender to institutional silence mark the beginning of a modern, protective era for the crown, or has he drawn an irreconcilable battle line against the traditionalist old guard at Windsor? Where should history draw the line between the sacred duty of a father and the unyielding demands of the throne? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If you found this investigation compelling, please hit the subscribe button, turn on the notification bell, and give this video a like to support our independent deep dives into the untold stories and power struggles behind the world's most guarded dynasties. Thank you for watching, and we will see you in the next installment.